The whole thing began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind where the world feels wrapped in cotton and every sound seems muffled. I'd just finished organizing my recipe collection, the smell of vanilla candles still lingering in the air, when I decided to treat myself to some hot tea and catch up on my favorite cooking show. But as soon as I pressed the power button, my television made a concerning buzzing sound before the screen flickered once and died completely. Initially, I figured it was probably just the surge protector or maybe the outlet acting up. I tried everything I could think of, checking all the connections, testing different power sources, even consulting the manual I'd kept tucked away in a kitchen drawer. Nothing helped. Just dead silence where my programs used to be. Technology has never been my strong suit, I'll admit. I can navigate my way around basic streaming services, and I've gotten pretty good at ordering groceries online. But when it comes to anything more technical than that, well, I'm completely out of my depth. That's when I remembered Marcus. Marcus had relocated to the house across the street roughly 18 months ago following his divorce. A soft-spoken gentleman in his late 50s, he was always courteous and wore this easy, genuine smile. He mostly kept to his own business, but we'd shared enough friendly chats while collecting mail, and he'd helped me with a fallen tree branch once, so I felt okay about asking for assistance. I grabbed my favorite shawl, tucked a few loose curls behind my ears, and made my way over, teacup still warm in my hands, feeling somewhat embarrassed about needing help with something so straightforward. His home had character, well maintained, with a charming front porch and a small herb garden that always seemed to be flourishing with bright yellow marigolds whose names I could never quite recall. I tapped gently on his front door. After a few moments, I could hear measured footsteps approaching, and then the door swung open. "Hello there, Marcus," I said, offering a smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt your day, but I seem to have broken my television somehow, and I was hoping you might be able to take a quick look." He paused for a second, seeming surprised by the request. Then his expression warmed. "Of course," he replied. "Let me just grab my toolkit." Back in my living room, he examined the chaos of wires and devices stacked behind my entertainment center while I stood at a respectful distance, trying not to seem anxious. "Looks like you've got about half of an electronics store connected back here," he said with gentle amusement. I couldn't help but laugh, maybe with more relief than the comment warranted. "That sounds exactly right. My daughter set everything up before she moved across the country, and I've been afraid to disturb anything since." He knelt down, adjusted a few connections, and within no time at all, the screen came back to life. The cheerful theme music from my cooking show filled the space, and I exhaled deeply with gratitude. "There you are," he said, brushing off his hands. "Just a loose cable behind your streaming device." "A loose what?" I asked. He grinned. "Don't worry about it." I offered him some tea to show my appreciation, and somewhat surprisingly, he said, "Yes." We settled in my breakfast nook, the space I always kept tidy, but seldom actually used. The morning sunlight poured through the bay window, creating dancing patterns across the checkered tablecloth. "I hardly ever sit in here," I admitted, setting down a steaming mug for him. "It always feels like it belongs to someone else's story." He took a careful sip, gazing out toward my small backyard. "It's lovely, very peaceful." We chatted for quite a while about ordinary things, and deeper matters too. I discovered he'd worked as a middle school art teacher. He shared how empty his house felt since his ex-wife moved out, how he'd taken up pottery to occupy his time. I found myself listening more than talking, but somehow that felt comfortable to. As the morning light shifted and grew stronger, something changed between us. A type of quietude that wasn't uncomfortable but rather gentle, the kind of hush you don't feel compelled to break. He glanced at me then, not in any obvious or forward way, but with a sort of kind attention that made me feel noticed. It had been quite some time since anyone had looked at me that way, truly seen me, not as someone's mother or the lady from down the street or a divorced woman living alone, just me. I cleared my throat and got to my feet, disrupting the spell. "Well, I suppose I should let you return to your morning," I said. "Thank you so much again, Marcus. I would have been completely lost without my shows." He rose as well, hesitating just a moment before nodding. "Happy to help," he said. "You know where to find me." As I shut the door after him, I leaned against it briefly, pulse quietly quickening. It was simply a neighbor lending a hand with electronics, wasn't it? And yet somehow it felt like more than that. The following several days went by without incident, though I couldn't quite dismiss the strange flutter that had made itself at home in my chest. Every time I passed by the breakfast nook or browsed through television channels, I found my thoughts drifting to Marcus, not in some giddy adolescent way, but more like a half-remembered song I couldn't quite identify, gentle and persistent. I hadn't anticipated seeing him again so soon. It was a simple favor, a neighborly act. But on Saturday afternoon, as I ventured outside to water my flower boxes, there he was, crouched beside his herb garden, with gardening shears in hand, wearing a sun hat slightly too large for his head, and humming quietly to himself. I wavered. He appeared content, like someone lost in his own tranquil world. But then he noticed me and made eye contact. "Good afternoon," he said, smiling warmly. "Afternoon," I replied, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. "Your marigolds are looking spectacular." He glanced toward them. "Yours always blooms so much earlier." "Must be your green thumb," I laughed, though I felt warmth creep up my neck. "More like blind luck. I still have to look up pruning instructions every season." He straightened up and brushed soil from his knees. "Actually, I was wondering, I made way too much chili yesterday. Would you be interested in helping me finish it off?" I hate letting good food go to waste. I paused, not because I wasn't interested. Honestly, I hadn't shared a meal with anyone at my dining table in ages, but because something about his invitation felt more significant than it probably should have. Still, I found myself nodding. "That sounds wonderful." That evening, I sat in his cozy dining room, a bowl of hearty 3-bean chili steaming before me. The room felt lived in and welcoming. A few small succulents decorated the windowsill, and framed pictures of his children and their families were arranged on a corner bookshelf. We talked throughout dinner, and this time our conversation went beyond surface pleasantries. He told me about his former wife Sarah, how they'd met at a teaching conference, how she used to bake apple turnovers every weekend, how their marriage had slowly unraveled over disagreements they could never quite resolve. I opened up about my own former husband, the years of joy and tension and accommodation, about the quiet home he'd left behind and how the stillness seemed to seep into the very foundation. There was a moment when we simply regarded each other. No explanations, no words needed, just recognition. Two people who had survived life's challenges and were still here, still present, still willing to try. "Do you ever feel like you're anticipating something?" I asked him quietly, not entirely sure why I voiced the thought. Marcus set down his spoon and considered this. "I used to. Then I figured out maybe it wasn't something I was anticipating, but someone." I felt my breath catch. There was nothing suggestive in his words, nothing presumptuous or aggressive, just an honest truth shared softly, and somehow that made it even more affecting. After we cleaned up together, I found myself lingering near his front door longer than usual. "Thank you," I said, meaning more than just the meal, "for having me over." He gave me that gentle smile again, the one that felt effortless. "You're always welcome." I nodded, experiencing an odd tightness beneath my ribs. Not sorrow exactly, something deeper, something like possibility. As I made my way home, I became aware of how the evening breeze stirred the leaves just so, how the setting sun had settled into that amber light I'd always cherished. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no grand gestures, no sweeping romance, just the subtle sense that something had evolved between us, something modest but genuine. And that night, as I settled under my quilt with the television playing softly, I barely noticed the program. My mind kept returning to that warm dining room and the man across the street. The next couple of weeks established a pleasant, unhurried pattern. Marcus and I didn't make official arrangements. There were no planned dinners or excuses involving household emergencies. It was more like an unspoken understanding. Some evenings I'd spot him on his front porch with his pottery wheel and a cup of coffee, and I'd stroll over, pretending I just happened to be taking a walk. Other times he'd bring over a few herbs from his garden or a portion of something he'd prepared. Lemon bars, zucchini bread, things that tasted like patience and thoughtfulness. We didn't discuss what was developing between us, but it was evident in the way he'd glance up before I even approached, or how I'd catch myself choosing a nicer sweater or applying a touch of lipstick before stepping outdoors. One evening, shortly after my usual dinner time, I heard a gentle rap at my door. It surprised me. Marcus typically waited for me to visit him, and I felt unexpectedly nervous as I answered it. He stood there holding a small ceramic bowl in his hands. "I was working on this," he said, meeting my eyes, "and I'm not sure Why? But I thought you might appreciate it. He offered it to me with careful reverence. It was smooth and perfectly formed, glazed in soft blue-green, with delicate leaf patterns etched around the rim. One of those marigolds from his garden. I traced my fingers along the design, heart racing. It's absolutely lovely, I murmured. Marcus, I'm speechless. He shrugged modestly, but his gaze held something unvoiced. You don't need to say anything. I invited him inside. The house carried the scent of jasmine from a diffuser I'd started earlier, and the table lamps created a golden ambience throughout the space, making everything feel softer, more intimate. We sat in the breakfast nook once more, and this time, I poured 2 glasses of wine. I rarely indulge on weeknights, but this evening felt special, like something warranted celebration, even if we couldn't name it. You're quite gifted, I said, gesturing toward the bowl. He chuckled. It keeps my hands occupied, helps me process things. What kinds of things do you process? I asked, not quite meeting his eyes. There was a pause. You, he said simply. I looked up, heart pounding. There it was. I'm not sure what I expected in that moment. Perhaps I'd deflect with humor. Perhaps I'd redirect the conversation or act like I hadn't heard him clearly. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I said, I've been thinking about you as well. We remained quiet after that. The kind of quiet that doesn't require filling. The atmosphere felt more intense, charged, but not uncomfortably so. He looked at me, really looked the way he had that first morning in the breakfast nook. And this time I didn't turn away. You know, he said, voice gentle, when Sarah and I separated, I assumed that chapter of my life was finished. Not just the marriage, the connection, the intimacy, the experience of being truly understood. I nodded, understanding more deeply. Then he realized. I felt invisible for years, I admitted, even when surrounded by family, especially then actually. You're not invisible, he said softly, not to me. And there it was again, that quiet honesty between us. Not hurried, not forced, just real. He didn't take my hand. He didn't move closer. He simply remained there with me, sharing the space, the moment, the significance of everything unspoken. Eventually he rose to leave, and as I walked him to the door, I felt something settle within me, something I hadn't experienced in years, hope. Before stepping outside, he stopped, turned around. Would you like to join me for dinner tomorrow evening? He asked. I was planning to make apple turnovers. I smiled. I'd love that, I said, and I meant it completely. Marcus's house carried the aroma of cinnamon and baked apples when I arrived the following evening. It was one of those soft, golden moments when the sun lingers low and everything outdoors appears brushed with amber. He welcomed me wearing an apron dusted with flour and that same warm smile that had begun to feel like coming home. Dinner's nearly ready, he said, but I might need someone to taste test the turnovers. I laughed as I entered. That's quite a responsibility. What if I have very high standards? I'm prepared to take that chance, he said, his eyes bright and playful. The table was arranged simply. No elaborate place settings, just 2 plates, cloth napkins, and a small mason jar filled with those bright marigolds from his garden. The care didn't announce romance, it suggested it quietly, respectfully. We shared roasted salmon and asparagus with garlic, the kind of comfort food that speaks of time and attention. Conversation flowed naturally now, like longtime friends who'd finally begun voicing the thoughts they used to keep private. After dinner, he presented the turnovers, golden and flaky, with vanilla ice cream slowly melting alongside. I took a bite and sighed contentedly. All right, I said, feigning seriousness. This might be the finest apple turnover I've tasted since my grandmother's in 1987. Marcus laughed. I'll consider that high praise. We relocated to his living room afterward, where the lighting was dim and soft folk music played quietly from an old radio. I settled on the sofa, and he sat nearby, not too close, but closer than before. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There was comfort in the silence, a kind of peace that comes when 2 people stop pretending they're merely acquaintances. At some point, he turned to me, voice tender. I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but I enjoy spending time with you. It feels natural, right? I studied him for a moment, the gentle creases around his eyes, the way his hands rested calmly on his knees, the man who'd appeared in small ways that had somehow transformed everything. It doesn't sound presumptuous, I said. It sounds honest. He extended his hand then, not boldly, not dramatically, just offered it between us, palm upward, like an invitation. I placed mine in his warm, steady, familiar. We remained like that for a long while. No hurry, no need to define anything. Eventually, I rested my head against his shoulder, and he released a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. Outside, life continued its rhythm. Cars passing, a neighbor's dog barking somewhere, the last birds of the day settling in for the night. But inside, it felt as though time had paused just for us. Several weeks passed, and things didn't transform overnight. We still maintained our separate homes, our individual routines. But now there was a gentle thread connecting our daily lives. Morning conversations, shared meals, the occasional laugh about how much I still didn't grasp about streaming devices. There were no grand declarations, no elaborate promises, just presence. And strangely, that felt like enough. More than enough. One afternoon, I sat in my breakfast nook, the ceramic bowl Marcus had made resting on the windowsill. I'd filled it with old postcards and pressed flowers, pieces of a life that once seemed distant, but now somehow felt nearer. I watched the sunlight illuminate the rim, highlighting the texture of the clay, the marigold pattern catching and reflecting the light. I reflected on how unexpected all of this had been. How a broken television had led to a conversation, which led to a meal, which led to something quietly remarkable, not a fantasy, something genuine. And at this stage of life, genuine is far more valuable than perfect.